The smoky air hung heavy in the dusty Spur saloon, thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and desperation. A man's booming voice, laced with challenge, had just sealed a fate. "If any man here can play that waltz," Henry Mallory roared, "he marries my daughter." Laughter, coarse and cruel, ripped through the room. But then a different sound. Fingers, stained with labor and grime, touched the dusty yellowed keys of the forgotten piano in the corner. A melody, pure and haunting, rose above the echoes of mockery. It wove a silence far heavier than any noise. A silence that promised a future no one, especially not the young woman standing rigid beside her father, had ever anticipated. Helena Mallory, 19 and dressed in silks that cost more than the saloon itself, felt her blood run cold. She knew that waltz. It was the lullaby her mother, long past, used to hum. A tune that was supposed to be a secret, a ghost only she remembered. And now, in this den of filth, it was being played. The raw, untamed energy of the saloon had been a symphony of 100 restless souls just moments before. Whiskey fumes mingled with raucous laughter and the clatter of cards. But her father, Henry Mallory, with his imposing frame and an air of absolute command, had silenced it all. He slammed his glass on the bar, a challenging grin spreading across his face as he swept his hand towards the piano. "If any man here," his voice boomed, "can play that waltz, he marries my daughter." A wave of crude guffaws thundered through the saloon. Helena's cheeks burned, her stomach twisting into a knot of mortification. She stood motionless, a lesson etched deep within her. Challenging Henry was always futile. He owned this town, he owned the land, he owned everything. And he thought he owned her. Amidst the jeers, a finger pointed to the barkeep. Miguel Duarte, a poor, unassuming figure, usually lost in the shadows, cleaning glasses with a worn-out rag. "The barkeep, Miguel!" they cried, laughter bubbling up anew. Patrons, emboldened by drink, shoved his slight frame towards the piano. Miguel stumbled, his dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and something else. Resignation. Henry, his smile laced with malicious delight, merely reinforced the command. "Go on, boy. Show us what you're capable of." The unspoken expectation was a fumbling failure. A few broken notes to amuse the crowd before her father dragged her home. Miguel sat on the worn stool, his calloused fingers hovering above the keys. The saloon held its breath, poised for disaster. Then a single, pure note. It was followed by another and another, weaving that delicate, haunting waltz that filled the space, pushing back the lingering echoes of ridicule. The music bloomed under his touch, surprising in its complexity, breathtaking in its beauty. But for Helena, it was terrifying. He wasn't just playing a waltz. He was playing her waltz, the Mallory waltz. A secret melody passed down through her mother's line, a song no one outside the family should ever know. The raucous laughter died, replaced by a thick, astonished silence. Each chord resonated with an unexpected depth, a vibrancy that spoke of hidden passions. Miguel's fingers danced across the keys with effortless grace, coaxing a story from the instrument that only he seemed to know. Even Helena, stiff with defiance, felt an unwelcome tremor. She couldn't deny the profound beauty of what she heard, but it wasn't beauty she felt. It was violation. As the last lingering note faded, Helena felt no pride, only a surge of cold repulsion. The music, instead of freeing her, felt like invisible chains tightening, binding her to a fate she despised and a man who held a secret he had no right to possess. Henry, still reeling from the unexpected triumph, cleared his throat, his voice regaining its booming authority, though a hint of disbelief lingered. "A Mallory does not go back on his word. This man will be my daughter's husband." The declaration exploded through the saloon, met by a stunned silence. Helena felt the words as a cold dread settling deep within her. How did he know that song? Who was this man, really? Back at the Mallory Ranch, in the opulent silence of her father's study, Helena erupted. "You can't be serious, Papa. To force me to marry a barkeep. It's an insult." Her voice, usually composed, was shrill with indignation, but a deeper fear churned beneath the anger. And that song, that was Mother's waltz. How could he possibly know it? Henry, however, remained an unyielding monolith, his gaze as hard as granite. He waved her concern away. "It's just a tune, Helena. A coincidence. I made a public promise. A Mallory never goes back on his word. The marriage is decided." He spoke with a finality that crushed any argument, but Helena saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He was unsettled, too. He recognized the tune, and it bothered him. But his pride was a fortress, and he would let nothing breach its walls. The following days were a torment. What infuriated Helena most was Miguel's utter indifference. He made no attempt to seek her out, to explain, or to appease her. He simply continued his duties at the dusty spur, a silent, unassuming figure. But now she watched him. Every evening the familiar melody of the piano drifted through the saloon windows, a haunting reminder of the night that had stolen her future. It wasn't just the waltz anymore. He played other songs, complex pieces filled with sorrow and longing that seemed out of place for a simple bartender. His quiet continuation of life, as if nothing had changed, felt like a deliberate slight, an insult to her pride. He didn't seem to fight for her, didn't struggle against the impossible situation, and that perceived apathy stung her as deeply as her father's tyrannical imposition. She was trapped, a bird in a gilded cage, and the man who held the key didn't even seem to care. Or worse, he was playing a game she didn't understand, a game that started with her mother's secret song. The forced cohabitation began not with a bang, but with a silence so profound it felt like a scream. The small, modest home Miguel inhabited was a stark contrast to Helena's childhood mansion. Every creaking floorboard, every unpolished surface, seemed to mock her inherited refinement. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her every gesture laced with disdain. Her eyes, usually vibrant, now held a frosty glaze whenever they met Miguel's. He, for his part, remained a study in quiet endurance, his presence a constant, infuriating reminder of her stolen life. She saw him as a symbol of her father's tyranny, a poor man who had, by cruel twist of fate, become her captor. Their meals were agonizing affairs of clinking cutlery and unspoken resentments. Helena would pick at her food, her delicate features contorted in a silent protest against the simplicity of the fare. It wasn't long before the hostile silence gave way to sharp, cutting words. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive quiet, she finally broke. This this isn't living, Miguel," she began, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "No servants, no proper linens, no dresses that don't smell of dust and honest labor. My father's house had a staff of 10. What is this life you expect me to endure?" Her words were a torrent of grievances. She was a woman accustomed to having her every whim catered to, and the sudden harsh reality of a life without luxury felt like a personal affront. Miguel, his back to her as he stoked the small hearth, turned slowly. His face, usually a mask of calm, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Not anger, not even annoyance, but a deep, quiet understanding. "Wealth is not what fills the eyes, Helena," he said, his voice surprisingly soft yet firm. "It is what fills the silence." Helena scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "Empty words from an empty pocket," she retorted, turning away. She refused to acknowledge the truth in his statement, refused to let any part of his world touch hers. Yet, despite her outward scorn, his words lingered, and her real question remained unspoken, a burning coal in her throat. How did you know that song? Days bled into weeks. Her initial rage, while still simmering, began to curdle into a dull, gnawing curiosity. She started watching him, not just with contempt, but with a grudging attention. She'd noticed things. The way he meticulously repaired a broken chair, his hands surprisingly skilled. The small, intricately carved wooden bird he kept on the mantelpiece, its craftsmanship far beyond that of a simple laborer. One night, unable to sleep, she crept through the quiet house. A sliver of light shone from beneath the door of a small back room she had never entered. Pushing it open a crack, she saw him not at a piano, but at a desk, surrounded by books. Books on architecture, on agriculture, on history. And on his desk, spread open, was a large hand-drawn map. It was a map of the valley, a map of her father's land, the Mallory Ranch, but it was labeled with a different name, the Duarte Valley. Her breath caught. Duarte. Miguel Duarte. It wasn't just a name, it was a claim. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was no coincidence. The waltz, the map, his name, it was all connected. He wasn't just a barkeep who got lucky. He was a man with a purpose that seemed to involve her family, her home. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt heavy with secrets. And she was living with the man at the center of them all. Her curiosity was now a raging fire. She began to search, cautiously at first, then with a reckless abandon born of desperation. She needed to understand. While Miguel was at the saloon, she went into the small room again. She looked through his books, the strange maps. Tucked away in an old, leather-bound volume of poetry, she found it. A faded photograph. It was a picture of a man and a woman standing proudly in front of a newly built ranch house. The woman was beautiful, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The man was handsome, his arm around her protectively. And in the woman's arms was a baby. Helena's blood ran cold. She recognized the house. It was her home, the Mallory Ranch. But the people in the picture, they weren't her grandparents. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, were two names, Ilara and Mateo Duarte, and below that, a date from 30 years ago. Duarte. This was his family, and they were standing on her land. As she stared at the photograph, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The woman, Ilara. She looked familiar. Helena rushed to her own room, to the small jeweled box where she kept her most precious mementos. She pulled out a miniature portrait of her own mother, painted when she was a young woman. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same gentle smile. Ilara Duarte and her mother could have been sisters. The world tilted on its axis. Her father had always told her that her mother was an orphan, a woman with no family to speak of, whom he had rescued from a life of poverty. It was a lie. Her mother had a family. She had a sister, and that sister had married a Duarte, the family her father always spoke of with such venom. The Duartes, he'd claimed, were thieves and vagabonds who had tried to steal their land a generation ago before being run out of the valley for good. Another lie. It was all lies. Miguel wasn't just some stranger. He was her cousin. And the waltz. It wasn't a Mallory waltz. It was a Duarte family waltz, passed from her Aunt Ilara to her mother, and then to her. This marriage wasn't a random act of drunken pride. It was something else entirely. A reckoning. She sank onto her bed, the photograph and the portrait in her hands. Her entire life, her entire identity, was built on a foundation of deceit. She wasn't just Helena Mallory, heiress to the largest ranch in the territory. She was the niece of the family her father had destroyed. And she was married to the son of the man he had wronged, the man who was now, piece by piece, staking his claim. The solid, unyielding anger that had once defined her interaction with Miguel started to crumble. replaced by a confusing storm of fear, betrayal, and a strange, unexpected flicker of connection. He was family. The only family she had left besides the father who had lied to her entire life. She looked at the carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece. She looked at the books on his desk. She listened to the complex, beautiful music that drifted from the saloon each night. This was not the simple barkeep she had despised. This was a man of culture, of intelligence, of history. Her history. And she, for the first time, found herself wondering about the man she was bound to, not as a captor, but as a keeper of secrets that were also her own. The subtle shift in the dynamic between Helena and Miguel, a fragile seedling of understanding pushing through the hardened ground of disdain, did not escape Henry Mallory's keen, possessive gaze. He was a man who saw everything, especially where his daughter was concerned. He'd observed Helena lingering in the general store a moment too long when Miguel was there. He saw the faint softening around her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He noticed that the sharp, cutting edge of her voice had dulled, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. Each tiny gesture was a fresh wound to his formidable pride. The rage that simmered beneath Henry's composed exterior was a dry, burning fire. It was an affront, an unbearable insult, to witness his meticulously groomed daughter, a Mallory by blood and bearing, begin to develop feelings for a penniless barkeep. But it was more than that now. He sensed she was learning things, uncovering secrets he had buried long ago. The thought was anathema, a grotesque distortion of his carefully constructed world. He had forced this marriage, yes, a public decree born of a stubborn oath. But the intent was always to teach Helena a lesson in humility, to show her the consequences of his absolute power. He never intended for her to truly embrace this life. He certainly never intended for her to uncover the truth. The idea that she might choose such a path, that she might actually care for Miguel Duarte, the last of that wretched line, filled him with a venomous fury. He was trapped by his own unyielding promise, a public declaration that could not be rescinded without irreparable damage to his reputation. Yet he would not, could not, allow his daughter to be tied to such a man, not in spirit, not in heart. Especially not now when the ghosts of the past were stirring. Pride and prejudice, two intertwined serpents coiled tightly within him, whispering of an ultimate solution. Miguel would not reach the altar alive. The wedding was still a week away. Plenty of time. Under the cloak of a moonless night, the air thick with the scent of dry earth and pine, Henry summoned two of his most trusted henchmen. Silas and Jed, men whose loyalty was bought with coin and fear, stood before him in the shadowed stable. Their faces were grim, their eyes devoid of question. "Tomorrow night," Henry began, his voice a low growl that held the weight of an executioner's decree. "Miguel will be taking the back road from the saloon to his cabin. It's deserted past the old creek bed. Make sure he doesn't make it to morning." He paused, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "No witnesses, no fuss. Make it look like a drifter's attack. You understand?" Silas, a man whose features were as rough-hewn as a tree stump, nodded once. Jed, whose eyes seemed to hold a permanent gleam of cold calculation, simply tightened his grip on the hilt of his Bowie knife. They understood. Their loyalty was absolute. He watched them ride off into the vast, swallowing darkness, two dark specters disappearing into the night. The plan was set, the deed all but done. A grim satisfaction settled over him. The promise of reclaiming his daughter's future, of severing this unsightly entanglement, and of burying the past once and for all. He would be rid of the last Dwart. Helena, restless and troubled by her discoveries, had been pacing near the rear entrance of the main house. The unseasonably warm night had led her to open a window, seeking a breath of cooler air. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the low, guttural voices drifting from the stables caught her attention. It was Henry's voice, hushed yet distinct, followed by the gruff tones of Silas and Jed, her father's most menacing enforcers. A cold knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She pressed herself against the wall, listening, her breath catching in her throat. Fragments of the conversation drifted to her. Back road, deserted past the old creek bed. Make sure he doesn't make it to morning. Each word was a shard of ice piercing her growing dread until the final chilling pronouncement, "Look like a drifter's attack." Her heart, which moments before had been merely fluttering with vague anxieties, now began to pound in a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The blood drained from her face. Miguel. They were talking about Miguel. Her father was planning to have him murdered. The world tilted on its axis. In that agonizing instant of stark, brutal revelation, something within Helena shattered and then inexplicably solidified. The intricate wall of her disdain, her resentment, her inherited arrogance, crumbled into dust. A wave of overwhelming panic, cold and absolute, washed over her. But it was followed by a fierce, undeniable surge of a feeling she had not truly understood until this very second. She had been running, yes, ever since her father had decreed her fate. Running from the shame, from the unwanted life, from the man who embodied her forced future. But now, in the face of his imminent demise, she understood. Her sudden, desperate need to act was not born of duty, nor of some stubborn defiance of her father's will. It was born of a primal fear, a terror that ripped through her very core, the fear of losing him. Without realizing it, without acknowledging it, she had come to care for this quiet, secretive man who was her family. The quiet acts of kindness, the tender melodies, the gentle wisdom, the shared blood she never knew existed. They had all seeped into her, softening her hardened heart. And now this fragile, burgeoning connection was under threat of being violently extinguished. The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless but strangely empowered. This unexpected, fierce emotion had been quietly blooming in the shadows. And she, the pampered Helena, who had never truly fought for anything but her own comfort, suddenly knew with an absolute certainty that she was capable of fighting for this. She had to. She ran to the stables, her mind racing faster than her feet. She couldn't warn Miguel directly. Her father's men were everywhere. She couldn't go to the sheriff. He was in her father's pocket. There was only one thing to do. She had to get to that creek bed first. She saddled her fastest mare, her hands shaking but her movements swift and sure. She had to stop them. There was no other choice. The cold, unforgiving night air whipped at Helena's face, stinging her eyes as she galloped, spurred by a desperate, newfound resolve. The world blurred around her, dark, skeletal trees, the rushing shadow of the creek, the relentless thud of hooves against the dusty trail. Every beat of her horse's stride echoed the frantic pounding of her heart. She pushed the animal harder, her own lungs burning. A single, terrifying image was etched in her mind. Miguel, alone, facing her father's ruthlessness. The realization of her feelings, sparked in the terror of imminent loss, now fueled every fiber of her being, transforming the once pampered girl into a woman driven by a fierce, protective instinct. As she rounded the bend past the old creek bed, the scene illuminated by a sliver of moon ripped into focus. But it wasn't what she expected. Miguel was not backed against a tree. He was standing calmly beside his horse, which was drinking from the creek. Silas and Jed were there, dismounted, but they weren't attacking. They were talking to him, not threateningly, but in low, earnest tones. Helena pulled her horse to a halt in the shadows, confused. This wasn't an ambush. It was a meeting. She strained to hear their words. "Told you he'd pay double," Silas was saying. "Just needs you out of the way. Fake your death, Ride north and never come back. Easier for everyone. Miguel shook his head. I'm not leaving, he said, his voice quiet but firm. This land is my home. Jed stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Don't be a fool, Dwart. You take the money and live. You stay, and Mallory will just find another way. A way that ain't so clean. This is your one chance. A twist so sharp it took Helena's breath away. Her father hadn't ordered a murder. He had ordered a buyout, a staged disappearance. It was still monstrous, still a plot to remove Miguel from her life forever, but it wasn't the cold-blooded killing she had imagined. But Miguel's refusal changed everything. By staying, he was signing his own death warrant. And then the scene shifted. A low growl came from the shadows, and a massive dog, a breed she'd never seen before, emerged and stood beside Miguel, its eyes fixed on the two henchmen. Silas and Jed took an involuntary step back. They hadn't counted on the dog. It was then that Miguel looked up, his eyes piercing the darkness, and looked directly at her. He had known she was there the whole time. It's all right, Helena, he called out, his voice calm. You can come out. She hesitated for a moment, then urged her horse forward into the pale moonlight. Silas and Jed stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Their simple plan had just become incredibly complicated. What are you doing here? Silas growled. Before Helena could answer, another sound cut through the night. The heavy thud of approaching hooves. A figure on horseback emerged from the darkness, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. Henry Mallory. His face was a mask of thunderous fury. He had followed her. His eyes, burning with a dangerous light, swept over the scene. His daughter standing with the very man he intended to eliminate, and his henchmen caught in the middle of their failed negotiation. He dismounted, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. Helena. Henry's voice was a low snarl, thick with disbelief and incandescent anger. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Helena turned to face her father, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a resolute fire. I'm stopping you, Papa, she replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. I know what you sent them to do. You won't touch him. Henry's face contorted with a venomous fury. You little fool, he roared. You choose him over your family, over your name, over everything I've built for you. He took a menacing step towards her. I will not have a Duarte taint the Mallory name. If you insist on going through with this travesty, if you dare to marry this man, then consider yourself disinherited. You will have nothing. No fortune, no ranch, no name. You will be a pauper, just like him. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The full weight of his power and wrath laid bare. Silas and Jed watched, their faces impassive, awaiting a new command. Miguel stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Helena's arm, a silent anchor in the storm. His touch grounded her. Helena looked from her father's enraged face to Miguel's quiet, steadfast gaze. In that moment, the choice was not merely between wealth and poverty. It was between the life of lies she had been born into and the life of truth she had, against all odds, chosen for herself. She took a deep breath. Then disinherit me, Papa, she said, her voice firm. I don't need your fortune. She turned to Miguel. Or your ranch? Miguel looked at her, a question in his eyes. Then he turned to Henry, and for the first time, Helena heard the steel in his voice. You can't give her what isn't yours, Mallory. Henry laughed, a harsh, grating sound. This ranch has been in my family for 50 years. The deed is in my name. A forged deed, Miguel stated, his voice ringing with conviction. My father, Mateo Duarte, was the rightful owner. You drove him off this land, stole his home, and left him for dead. My mother, Ilara, died of a broken heart, and your wife. He glanced at Helena. Her own sister never recovered from the guilt. The accusation hit Henry like a physical blow. His face went pale. Lies, all lies. Is it? Miguel pressed. Then why did your wife teach her daughter the Duarte family waltz, a song of our people, a melody of our home? Did she teach it to Helena as a lullaby or as a confession? The silence that followed was more violent than any scream could have been. It fell like a physical blow, crushing the very air. Henry froze, utterly immobile, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a profound, agonizing defeat. His own wife, his beloved, had betrayed him in her own quiet way, planting the seed of the truth in their daughter. He stood there, a Titan brought low, a man utterly undone by his own history. Miguel's hand was still on Helena's arm. He had known all along. He had known who she was, who her mother was. His arrival, his playing of the waltz in the saloon. It was all part of a plan to reclaim his family's honor and their home. Not with violence, but with truth. Helena looked at him, not with a sense of betrayal, but with a dawning understanding. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his parents, for her mother, for their shared legacy. For the first time, she was not the spoiled daughter, not the girl in the expensive dress. She was a woman deciding her own fate, carving her own path, and standing beside the man who was showing her the way. The wedding, when it finally happened, was not the grand affair Henry Mallory would have orchestrated. There were no jewels, no opulent gowns, no important guests. It was a simple ceremony held in the quiet intimacy of a small chapel on the edge of town, attended by a handful of Miguel's few friends and the curious but respectful townsfolk. The only music was the gentle, heartfelt melody of the piano played by Miguel himself. He played the Duarte waltz, but this time it wasn't a challenge or a claim. It was a promise. Helena, standing beside him, wore a plain white dress, but her eyes held a steady, unwavering light. She was not just accepting a modest life, she was reclaiming a stolen one. The legal battle that followed was swift and brutal. Miguel produced the original deed, kept safe for 30 years by his father, who had, against all odds, survived Henry's attack and lived out his days in a distant territory. He had letters from Helena's mother to her sister Alara, detailing her sorrow and her husband's treachery. The evidence was overwhelming. Henry Mallory, stripped of his land, his fortune, and his reputation, became a broken man. He lived out his days in bitter isolation in a small boarding house, a prisoner of the pride that had consumed him. His ranch, once a vibrant hub of activity, became a silent monument to his unyielding will. But it was no longer his. It was the Duarte Mallory Ranch now. Helena and Miguel did not banish the name, but chose to unite it, honoring both their parents. The initial days were not about hardship, but about rebuilding. Helena, accustomed to a life of leisure, found a new purpose. She worked alongside Miguel, learning about the land, about the crops, about the quiet satisfaction of building something with your own hands. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused, but they were the hands of a creator, not a princess. Amidst the challenges, she discovered a different kind of happiness. Waking to the soft morning strains of Miguel's piano, sharing a comfortable silence that needed no words, laughing at small, unexpected joys. Their love, born not of grand declarations, but of shared history, shared struggles, and a deep, quiet understanding, grew not as a fleeting, passionate flame, but as a slow, steady fire, warming them from within. In the dusty Spur saloon, where it had all begun, she now often sat beside the piano, listening to Miguel's music. The melodies that had once symbolized her entrapment now wove the soundtrack of a life that, for the very first time, was truly, beautifully her own. Stripped of the glittering chains of expectation, she embraced a life woven not with gold threads, but with the honest fabric of shared moments and unwavering affection. The grand name of Mallory, once a badge of honor, became a distant echo, replaced by the silent strength of her own conviction. For Helena, the music that had once been a symbol of her unwilling imprisonment now swelled with the triumphant melody of her hard-won freedom, a soundtrack to a life finally and authentically her own. This story whispers a truth as old as the dusty plains, that the most profound wealth is often found not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to reclaim. Not in the lavish displays that fill the eyes, but in the quiet, steadfast affection that fills the silence of the heart. Helena chose to forfeit a name and a fortune built on lies for a truth she didn't know she possessed until it was threatened. What do you believe is the greatest sacrifice one can make for truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey through the Old West touched your spirit, perhaps our next tale will capture your imagination just as deeply. And if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of courage, consequence, and the enduring human spirit.